I'll never forget the sound of my name echoing across the open office floor at Davenport Manufacturing that Thursday morning. Mr. Walker, you've been served. I looked up from my workstation as every head in the accounting department slowly lifted with me. Standing there wearing a suit far too slick for a small Iowa town like Bettendorf was my wife's attorney, Daniel Price. He held a manila envelope like it contained the 10 Commandments, or a death sentence. He didn't wait for me to walk over. He strode straight to my desk, leaned in just enough to invade my space, and said with that little smirk of his, "Elaine's petition is final. She gets the house, the accounts, and full custody of the kids." Around us, keyboards stopped clicking. The hum of printers faded. You could have heard a pencil drop in the next cubicle. But Daniel wasn't finished. He lowered his voice not out of kindness, but to twist the knife. "She also wanted me to relay a message: the kids don't really consider you family anymore." For a moment, the words didn't land. Not really. They hovered in the air like dust caught in morning sunlight, visible, unsettling, but unreal. But I didn't argue. I didn't curse. I didn't even blink. I simply reached into the bottom drawer of my desk, lifted out the plain white envelope I'd placed there the night before, and handed it to him with a steady hand. "Make sure your client gets this," I said. He frowned. "What is it?" "Just an answer," I replied. Then I turned back to my computer as if the conversation were over. Because for me it was. Not a soul in the room spoke as he walked out. That was the moment everything truly began. You don't reach 57 years old without learning a few things about people: how they change, how they hide, how they justify things to themselves. And I had learned one thing in particular: when someone wants to erase you from your own life, they usually assume you'll just stand still and let them. Elaine had once been the girl who worked at the local library, the girl with quiet eyes and a soft voice, who believed in small joys, baking pies on Sunday mornings, saving for a modest retirement, volunteering at our daughter's school carnival. Somewhere along the way she drifted, or maybe she'd always been drifting, and I simply never saw the tide she was caught in. Either way, by the time she sent her attorney to ambush me at work, she'd turned into someone I barely recognized. Sharper, colder, always calculating. We'd lived under the same roof, but the love had evaporated years earlier, leaving behind something stale and sour. I started noticing the little shifts around year 12: secretive phone calls, unexplained expenses, long evenings out under the excuse of helping her mother. Nothing dramatic, just an accumulation of tiny betrayals that add up the way rust slowly eats through steel. But it was the money that told the truth. I've worked in accounting for over 3 decades. You get good at noticing numbers that don't belong. Elaine was sloppy, a couple missing statements, a credit card bill that didn't match what she said she spent on groceries, a transfer made at 2 a.m. to her uncle's business, an uncle she claimed she hadn't spoken to in years. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse. Instead, I learned. I asked questions silently, and I waited. One night about a year ago, I found a box in my late father-in-law's old workshop. I'd been helping Elaine's mother, Caroline, clear out some supplies. The box was mislabeled paintbrushes, but inside it, beneath a stack of rags, were documents. Dozens of them. Financial statements, a deferred prosecution agreement, an old letter from their family attorney. Signatures I recognized. Signatures I never expected to see. I remember sitting on the concrete floor, the cold seeping into my knees, reading until my hands shook. The documents weren't just suspicious, they were incriminating. And from the dates on them, the secret went back 15 years long before I'd ever noticed any cracks in Elaine's behavior. I didn't take the originals. I'm not that kind of man. But I made copies. And I asked a retired friend of mine, Charlie Harper, a former attorney at the VFW Post, to look through them. When he finished, all he said was, "Tom, if these ever go to a courtroom, they won't be the only ones answering questions." I didn't want vengeance. I didn't plan some grand scheme. I simply kept the envelope, saved it for the day I prayed would never come. And when Daniel Price swaggered into my office with divorce papers and taunts written to cut deep, I knew that day had arrived. I didn't check my phone the rest of the day, didn't call Elaine, didn't warn anyone. But at 6:12 p.m., as I pulled into my driveway on Tremont Street, my phone lit up: one missed call, Caroline, then another, then 6 more. By the time the sun dipped behind the maples, I had 12 missed calls from her side of the family. They had opened the envelope. And the quiet betrayal that started 14 years ago was finally coming home to roost. If you'd asked anyone in Bettendorf about us during our first few years of marriage, they would have said Elaine and I were steady, ordinary. The kind of couple you nod to in the grocery store aisle and think they've got their life figured out. And for a while, maybe we did. We bought our modest split-level house on Tremont Street the year after our daughter Maggie was born. Our son Joshua arrived 3 years later. We were never wealthy, but I had a good job in accounting at Davenport Manufacturing, and Elaine worked part-time at the library. Our weekends were church breakfasts, t-ball games, birthday candles, and summer drives along the Mississippi. That's what makes betrayal so peculiar. It rarely begins with fireworks or screaming matches. More often it comes quietly like a draft slipping through a window you thought was sealed shut. It was around year 12 when the first cold breeze hit. Elaine grew distracted, not cruel, not openly hostile, just subtly unreachable. She'd leave her phone face down on the kitchen counter when she never used to care who saw her screen. She joined her mother for errands that lasted 4 or 5 hours without explanation. Little things that didn't sound suspicious when spoken aloud but lived differently in the body. One evening, while Maggie was icing cupcakes at the kitchen island, she asked Dad, "Why does Mom say we owe Uncle Richard money? I thought we didn't owe anyone anything." I remember freezing with a dish towel in my hand. "We don't," I said carefully. "Why did she tell you that?" "She said not to worry about it," Maggie replied, shrugging, then went right back to her frosting. It was such a small moment, but it stuck with me like a splinter under the skin, easy to ignore for a while, impossible to forget. Elaine brushed it off later, saying she had miscommunicated something to Maggie and didn't want me to overthink. That word, overthink. It's what people say when they want you to feel foolish for noticing the truth. But I didn't push. I've spent my career reviewing financials, and I know numbers tell the story people try to hide. So instead of arguing with Elaine, I started paying attention to the patterns. A $900 withdrawal on a Monday, a $1,400 transfer at 2:17 a.m., credit card charges in Des Moines on nights she claimed she was visiting her mother. Still, I stayed calm. Middle-aged men don't panic the way younger men do. We've been through job scares, family illnesses, recessions. We learn to observe before we act. But the turning point came on an unremarkable Saturday in late September, one of those days when the air smells like dried leaves and the sky looks washed clean. Caroline, my mother-in-law, called, needing help clearing some boxes from the old woodworking shed behind her house. The place had been built by her late husband, a meticulous man who kept every receipt he ever touched. While lifting a set of dusty storage bins, I noticed one labeled paintbrushes, but the box was far too heavy for brushes. Inside, beneath a pile of cloth rags, lay a thick stack of rubber-banded documents. I might have put them aside without a second thought if not for the top sheet, a letterhead from an attorney's office in Des Moines, dated 15 years earlier, referencing a conditional non-prosecution agreement. My hands grew cold. I sat down on the concrete floor, wiped the dust from the first page, and read. Within minutes, it was clear someone in Elaine's family had been involved in a significant financial misconduct case years before I even met her. And based on the signatures, hers, her mother's, and her Uncle Richard's, they weren't passive witnesses. They were participants. I forced myself to stay steady. Years in accounting teach you that panic clouds the details. I didn't remove the documents. I didn't confront Caroline or Elaine. Instead, when I got home, I scanned what I remembered: names, dates, the case number, and quietly requested the public records associated with the matter. You'd be amazed what sits unnoticed in county archives. When the mailed copies arrived, I took them straight to my old friend Charlie Harper. Charlie practiced law for 40 years before retiring to play cribbage at the VFW. He reads legal text the way most men read baseball stats. He pored over the files for an hour before finally setting them down. "Tom," he said softly, "this is worse than you think. If this ever sees daylight, a lot of people are going to be answering questions, your wife included." I thanked him. I went home. I tucked the material into an envelope and placed it in my desk drawer at work. And then I waited. I'd hoped truly that I'd never need it. But one thing older folks understand better than anyone: life has a way of testing the things you try hardest to protect. 14 years of marriage, 2 children, a house built on sweat and patience. I would have worked through anything with Elaine, anything except deceit. So when her attorney walked into my office that Thursday morning, smirk carved into his face, and declared she'd take the house, the money, and both kids, I wasn't blindsided. I was prepared. The envelope I gave him wasn't a threat. It was the truth. And deep down, I think Elaine and her family always feared the day someone would find it. That day had arrived. And from the moment they opened that letter, the quiet unraveling of 15 years began, one trembling phone call at a time. By the time I walked through my front door that evening, the house felt unnaturally still. Not quiet still. The kind of stillness you notice after a storm when the wind stalls, and every sound seems to be waiting for the next shoe to drop. I set my keys on the table by habit, but even that small clink echoed louder than it should have in a home that had always felt lived in. My phone buzzed again. Caroline 14 missed calls. Richard 3 missed calls. Unknown numbers too many to count. I didn't answer any of them. I heated up leftover stew, sat at the kitchen table, and ate slowly. When you're 57, you learn to let the moment settle before you decide what to do with it. Panic never helped anyone my age, and I wasn't about to start now. Halfway through dinner, the phone lit up again. This time it was a voicemail. I hit play. Tom, sweetheart, please call me back. Please. We need to talk. Please, please. Caroline's voice cracked, not with anger, but with something worse, fear. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling. They knew. The envelope had been opened. The thing about secrets is that people assume they stay buried just because they never look at the ground. But truth doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. And once I found those documents in the woodworking shed, everything about the last 15 years made perfect sense. I remember the night I brought the copies to Charlie. We sat in his dimly lit den, surrounded by shelves lined with case books, baseball memorabilia, and an old framed American flag from his father's service. The smell of pipe tobacco clung to everything, even though he hadn't smoked in years. Charlie adjusted his reading glasses, squinted at the papers, and said, "Let's take this piece by piece." He explained the agreement. 15 years ago, Richard Elaine's uncle had been caught up in a financial scheme that skimmed funds from small business investors. It wasn't enough to make headlines, but enough to ruin reputations, require restitution, and potentially lead to prosecution. But there was one detail that made the whole mess personal. Elaine and Caroline had signed documents verifying false statements during the investigation, falsifying records, obstructing inquiries, shielding a relative from legal exposure. Charlie tapped the bottom of the page. This line here, this is the problem. If a prosecutor ever revisited the case, it wouldn't just be Richard answering questions. I remember asking softly, why would they do this? Charlie sighed. Family loyalty, most likely. Bad judgment. Pressure. Maybe all three. But your wife didn't disclose any of this to you before you married her. I shook my head. Not a word. He set the papers down and folded his hands. Tom, I'm sorry to say this, but if your marriage ever collapses into a legal fight, that document becomes leverage, heavy leverage. Not because you'd use it to hurt them, but because they know any courtroom will ask why they lied in the first place. That's when I decided I would never weaponize it, but I would not let myself be blindsided either. The envelope stayed buried in my desk drawer for more than a year. I hoped, truly hoped, that things would turn around, that Elaine and I could untangle whatever had knotted our marriage, that we could steer back toward who we used to be. But every month brought new distance, new excuses, new withdrawals from our joint account and from our life together. She'd grown comfortable believing she could shape reality however she wanted, financially, emotionally, even legally. And then came her attorney's visit. The smirk, the claim that she'd take everything, the cruel line about the kids not wanting my name anymore. That was the moment I knew she wasn't drifting anymore. She was gone. And the only thing left to do was protect myself from the fallout she had invited. Around 8:45 that night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands, my phone rang again. This time I answered. Tom, Caroline's voice trembled. I'm here, I said. You saw those papers. You knew about this. She wasn't angry. She wasn't defensive. She sounded like a woman standing at the edge of a cliff, staring into a past she hoped would never resurface. I did, I said, for over a year. Oh God, she broke into sobs. Tom, we were pressured. We thought it was the only way to keep the family together. You can't let this come out. You can't. If the court sees any of that, Tom, please. She wasn't calling for herself. She was calling because she knew what this meant for Elaine. Caroline, I said gently, I haven't sent anything to anyone. I haven't filed anything. I didn't expose a thing. There was a long silence. But Elaine, she whispered, she doesn't know how deep the consequences go. I let out a slow breath. She should have thought about that before she tried to take my children from me. Caroline cried softly, please, let's talk in person. Tomorrow morning, please. I didn't promise anything. I didn't threaten anything either. I simply said, we'll see. When I hung up, I watched the lights from passing cars reflect off the wet pavement. The night felt heavy but not frightening, more like a reckoning long overdue. The truth wasn't mine to create, but it was mine to hold. And now they finally understood that. Caroline wasn't the only one who tried reaching me that night, but she was the only voice I chose to hear. After her call, I turned my phone face down and let the rest of the messages gather on their own. I didn't need to listen to panic to understand it. Some emotions carry the same tone no matter who speaks them. By morning, the autumn air had that sharp bite it gets in Iowa when the seasons finally make up their minds. When I stepped onto the front porch, the wind carried the smell of damp leaves and distant chimney smoke. A calm morning, almost peaceful. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat outside watching the neighborhood. Wake-up dog walkers, school buses, a retired couple strolling past with their morning thermoses. It was a normal day for everyone else, but not for Elaine's family. Around 7:20 a.m., I saw a familiar silver sedan pull up slowly in front of my house. Elaine stepped out first, her coat clutched tightly around her face, pale, in a way I hadn't seen since her father's funeral. Behind her came Caroline, eyes rimmed red. They stood together on the sidewalk for a moment, gathering courage before walking up the path to the porch. I didn't stand. I didn't move. I'd spent years adjusting myself to their moods, their changes, their storms, but not today. Tom, Elaine said softly. Her voice didn't have its usual edge. It was flat, brittle like glass that could crack at any second. I nodded. Morning. She hesitated. May we come in? No, I said simply. We can talk here. She blinked, taken aback. Elaine never liked being refused anything. Not seats, not explanations, not control. But she didn't argue. Not today. Caroline stepped forward first. Tom, we opened the envelope. Her voice shook. I figured. The older woman wrung her hands. You have to understand. We did what we thought was right at the time. Richard was facing real charges. We were being told the family could fall apart, that reputations could be ruined. Yes, I said calmly. That's usually what happens when people commit crimes. Elaine's eyes flashed. It wasn't like that. You don't understand. I understand perfectly, I cut in. My tone stayed level the way it does when you've carried disappointment long enough for it to lose its heat. I understand that you lied. I understand that you hid it. And I understand that you hoped it would never come up again. Elaine swallowed. Tom, please, if this gets out. I haven't shown anything to anyone, I said. You know that. Caroline stepped closer. But your letter, Tom, your letter made it sound like... My letter stated the truth, I said. Before your lawyer and my wife attempted to strip me of everything in my life, my home, my savings, my relationship with my kids, I wanted to make sure you all remembered what the truth actually looked like. Elaine's shoulders sagged. She sat down on the porch step as if her legs could no longer carry what the past 24 hours had dropped on her. Please, she whispered, staring at the ground. Please don't let the court see those papers. Don't do this to us. There was a long silence, the kind that makes neighbors slow down their walking pace to watch from a distance. And then I said it. You already did it to yourselves. Elaine looked up sharply. I never meant Tom. I didn't think you'd actually fight. You're always so calm, so reasonable. That was your mistake, I said. You mistook quiet for weakness. For the first time in years, there was something like recognition on her face. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to respect, late damaged but real. Tom, what do you want? She finally asked. It wasn't a bargaining tone. It wasn't a challenge. It was a question from someone who suddenly realized the person across from them wasn't as predictable as she believed. I took a slow breath, watching a school bus rumble down the street. What I've always wanted, I said. Fairness, respect. A divorce that doesn't turn our children into bargaining chips. And an agreement that reflects 14 years of shared life, not one person grabbing for everything while the other stands there empty-handed. Elaine nodded, tears rising. Caroline wiped her eyes. I can talk to the attorney, Elaine said quietly. We can withdraw the petition, start over, do it right. That's all I asked, I said. We talked for nearly 30 minutes calmly for the first time in a long while. Not as enemies, not as partners, just as two people who had exhausted every illusion they once clung to. When they finally left, I watched them walk down the path, shoulders hunched, footsteps slow, as if years of buried truth were pressing down on them with each step. I knew the calls would come again, this time from their attorney, from their brother, from everyone who once thought I was too mild to stand my ground. But I didn't worry. The moment on my porch had shifted something fundamental. Elaine had realized the truth. I didn't want revenge. I wanted dignity, and I was willing to protect it. As they drove away, I went back inside, poured a fresh cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table in the sunlight. For the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt honest. The following Monday, I drove to Davenport Manufacturing with a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. Not confidence, exactly, something quieter. Something like an inner alignment that finally clicked into place. The Mississippi River shimmered beside the highway, pale morning light glinting off its surface, and for the first time in a long while, I breathed without the tightness in my chest. By the time I pulled into the parking lot, the fallout from that porch conversation had already begun making its rounds. My phone buzzed with 3 new messages from Elaine's lawyer, none of which I opened. I didn't need to. But I wasn't expecting what happened next. Just as I stepped out of my truck, I heard someone call my name. Tom, hold up. It was Daniel Price, the same attorney who had strutted into my workplace days earlier with all the arrogance of a man who thought he held every card in the deck. But he didn't walk toward me with a smirk this time. He walked the way you approach a wounded animal, slowly, carefully, a hint of caution in every step. Tom, he said, catching his breath, we need to talk. I didn't say a word. I let him talk to the early October wind, the rustling of leaves, the distant rumble of trucks moving freight along the river. He cleared his throat. My client would like to amend the petition. Withdraw it, I said. Yes, absolutely, withdraw. He nodded quickly, too quickly. She's prepared to discuss a balanced settlement, something fair, equitable. In custody, I asked. We're not contesting anything at this time, he said, swallowing. Your wife understands that a cooperative arrangement is best for the children. My children, not her children, not the children. Mine. It was the first time he'd said it that way. A small thing maybe, but important. Words matter, especially to people in my age bracket who've lived entire decades learning that what's spoken aloud often reveals far more than what's whispered behind closed doors. I'll have my own attorney review whatever you send, I said, walking past him toward the entrance. Of course, he replied, stepping back like a man who'd narrowly avoided touching a hot stove. He didn't follow me inside. The weeks that followed were slow but steady. Elaine honored her promises, withdrawing her aggressive demands, accepting a fair division of assets, and agreeing to an uncomplicated custody arrangement. There were tense moments, certainly, but they never exploded. Not after that morning on my porch. The truth has a way of humbling people. One afternoon in mid-November, we met at Johnson County Courthouse, our final meeting before signing the settlement papers. The courthouse was crowded full of parents handling custody exchanges, older couples ending long marriages, and young lawyers hurrying in and out with briefcases swinging at their sides. Elaine sat across from me, hands folded, staring at the tabletop. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in spirit. When everyone else stepped out to make copies, she finally spoke. Tom, she said quietly, I'm sorry. It wasn't theatrical. It wasn't strategic. It was an apology from a woman who had run out of places to hide. I shouldn't have tried to take everything, she continued. You didn't deserve that. No, I said gently, I didn't. She nodded, accepting it. No argument, no defensiveness. And the kids, she whispered, I shouldn't have dragged them into this. I didn't tell her it was all right. It wasn't. But I did say something true. We can still protect them from the worst of this. That's what matters now. She looked up at me, then really looked. Not as a rival, not as someone she wanted to defeat, but as the man she had once trusted enough to build a life with. Thank you, she whispered. The judge returned shortly after. We signed the documents, shook hands, and just like that, the war that never needed to happen was finally over. When I left the courthouse, I didn't feel triumphant the way younger men imagine revenge will feel. No soundtrack played, no choir sang, no sudden feeling of power washed over me. Instead, I felt something far more valuable at 57 years old. Relief, clarity, a quiet sense of justice, not vengeance. I walked out into the cool afternoon, listening to the sound of leaves scraping across the pavement, the rhythmic toll of the courthouse clock, and the hum of life continuing around me. Cars passed. People laughed. A young father pushed a stroller past the bench where I stopped to rest. Life goes on if you let it. That night, after a simple dinner, I opened my desk drawer, took out the folder of documents, and carried it to the backyard fire pit. The sky was clear, scattered with stars. A chill sat in the air. I struck a match. The paper's curled glowed and finally broke into drifting ash. Some truths serve a purpose. Others only serve the past. And I was done living in the past. As the fire died down, I felt something settle inside me. Not a victory, not a loss, but a restoration. A sense that I had finally protected the one thing I almost let slip away. My dignity. To the listeners who've walked beside me through this story, especially those my age, better than anyone, that life doesn't always give us easy choices, but it does give us chances to stand up for ourselves with honesty, patience, and quiet strength. If this story meant something to you, if it reminded you of your own resilience, I invite you to share it, reflect on it, or join me for the next one. We're all still learning. We're all still finding our way. And sometimes the quietest voice in the room carries the most truth.